facing the police every single day.
Criminalizing childhood, school safety measures turn schools into prisons and don't make kids safer. Reactionary measures to make schools safer are doing everything to build a police state and nothing to make children safer. By the Free Thought Project, September 9, 2018. Every day in communities across the United States, children and adolescents spend the majority of their waking hours in schools that have increasingly come to resemble places of detention more than places of learning. From metal detectors to drug tests, from increased policing to all-seeing electronic surveillance, the public schools of the 21st century reflect a society that has become fixated on crime, security, and violence. Investigative journalist Annette Fuentes. It used to be that if you talked back to a teacher, or played a prank on a classmate, or just failed to do your homework, you might find yourself in detention or doing an extra writing assignment after school. Of course, that was before school shootings became a part of our national lexicon. Nowadays, as a result of the government's profit-driven campaign to keep the nation safe from drugs, weapons, and terrorism, students are not only punished for minor transgressions such as playing cops and robbers on the playground, bringing Legos to school, or having a food fight, but they are being punished with suspension, expulsion, and even arrest. Welcome to Compliance 101, the police state's primer in how to churn out compliant citizens and transform the nation's schools into quasi-prisons through the use of surveillance cameras, metal detectors, police patrols, zero-tolerance policies, lockdowns, drug-sniffing dogs, strip searches and active shooter drills. If you were wondering, these police state tactics have not made the schools any safer. Rather, they've turned the schools into authoritarian microcosms of the police state, containing almost every aspect of the militarized, intolerant, senseless, over-criminalized, legalistic, surveillance-riddled, totalitarian landscape that plagues those of us on the outside. If your child is fortunate enough to survive his encounter with the public schools, you should count yourself fortunate. Most students are not so lucky. From the moment a child enters one of the nation's 98,000 public schools to the moment he or she graduates, they will be exposed to a steady diet of draconian zero-tolerance policies that criminalize childish behavior, overreaching anti-bullying statutes that criminalize speech, school resource officers, police, tasked with disciplining and/or arresting so-called disorderly students, standardized testing that emphasizes rote answers over critical thinking, politically correct mindsets that teach young people to censor themselves and those around them, and extensive biometric and surveillance systems that, coupled with the rest, acclimate young people to a world in which they have no freedom of thought, speech, or movement. By the time the average young person in America finishes their public school education, nearly 1 out of every 3 of them will have been arrested. More than 3 million students are suspended or expelled from schools every year, often for minor misbehavior, such as disruptive behavior or insubordination. Black students are 3 times more likely than white students to face suspension and expulsion. Zero-tolerance policies that were intended to make schools safer by discouraging the use of actual drugs and weapons by students have turned students into suspects to be treated as criminals by school officials and law enforcement alike, while criminalizing childish behavior. For instance, 9-year-old Patrick Timony was sent to the principal's office and threatened with suspension after school officials discovered that one of his Legos was holding a 2-inch toy gun. David Morales, an 8-year-old Rhode Island student, ran afoul of his school's zero-tolerance policies after he wore a hat to school decorated with an American flag and tiny plastic army figures in honor of American troops. School officials declared the hat out of bounds because the toy soldiers were carrying miniature guns. A 7-year-old New Jersey boy, described by school officials as a nice kid and a good student, was reported to the police and charged with possessing an imitation firearm after he brought a toy Nerf-style gun to school. The gun shoots soft ping-pong-type balls. Things have gotten so bad that it doesn't even take a toy gun to raise the ire of school officials. A high school sophomore was suspended for violating the school's no cell phone policy after he took a call from his father, a master sergeant in the U.S. Army who was serving in Iraq at the time. A 12-year-old New York student was hauled out of school in handcuffs for doodling on her desk with an erasable marker. In Houston, an 8th grader was suspended for wearing rosary beads to school in memory of her grandmother. The school has a zero-tolerance policy against the rosary, which the school insists can be interpreted as a sign of gang involvement. 6-year-old Cub Scout Zachary Christie was sentenced to 45 days in reform school after bringing a camping utensil to school that can serve as a fork, knife, or spoon. Even imaginary weapons, hand-drawn pictures of guns, pencils twirled in a threatening manner, imaginary bows and arrows, even fingers positioned like guns, can also land a student in detention. Equally outrageous was the case in New Jersey where several kindergartners were suspended from school for 3 days for playing a make-believe game of cops and robbers during recess and using their fingers as guns. With the distinctions between student offenses erased, and all offenses expellable, we now find ourselves in the midst of what Time magazine described as a national crackdown on Alka-Seltzer. Students have actually been suspended from school for possession of the fizzy tablets in violation of zero-tolerance drug policies. Students have also been penalized for such inane crimes as bringing nail clippers to school, using Listerine or Scope, and carrying fold-out combs that resemble switchblades. A 13-year-old boy in Manassas, Virginia, who accepted a Cert's breath mint from a classmate, was actually suspended and required to attend drug awareness classes, while a 12-year-old boy who said he brought powdered sugar to school for a science project was charged with a felony for possessing a look-alike drug. Acts of kindness, concern, basic manners, or just engaging in childish behavior can also result in suspensions. One 13-year-old was given detention for exposing the school to liability by sharing his lunch with a hungry friend. A 3rd grader was suspended for shaving her head in sympathy for a friend who had lost her hair to chemotherapy. And then there was the high school senior who was suspended for saying "bless you" after a fellow classmate sneezed. In South Carolina, where it's against the law to disturb a school, more than 1,000 students a year, some as young as 7 years old, face criminal charges for not following directions, loitering, cursing, or the vague allegation of acting obnoxiously. If charged as adults, they can be held in jail for up to 90 days. Another 12-year-old was handcuffed and jailed after he stomped in a puddle, splashing classmates. Things get even worse when you add police to the mix. Thanks to a combination of media hype, political pandering and financial incentives, the use of armed police officers, aka school resource officers, to patrol school hallways has risen dramatically in the years since the Columbine school shooting, nearly 20,000 by 2003. What this means, notes Mother Jones, is greater police involvement in routine discipline matters that principals and parents used to address without involvement from law enforcement officers. Funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, these school resource officers, SROs, have become de facto wardens in the elementary, middle, and high schools, doling out their own brand of justice to the so-called criminals in their midst with the help of tasers, pepper spray, batons, and brute force. As a result, students are not only being ticketed, fined, and sent to court for behavior perceived as defiant, disruptive, or disorderly, such as spraying perfume and writing on a desk, but they are also finding themselves subjected to police tactics such as handcuffs, leg shackles, tasers, and excessive force for acting up. In the absence of school-appropriate guidelines, police are more and more stepping in to deal with minor rule-breaking, sagging pants, disrespectful comments, brief physical skirmishes. What previously might have resulted in a detention or a visit to the principal's office was replaced with excruciating pain and temporary blindness, often followed by a trip to the courthouse. The horror stories are legion. One SRO is accused of punching a 13-year-old student in the face for cutting in the cafeteria line. That same cop put another student in a chokehold a week later, allegedly knocking the student unconscious and causing a brain injury. In Pennsylvania, a student was tossed after ignoring an order to put his cell phone away. On any given day when school is in session, kids who act up in class are pinned face down on the floor, locked in dark closets, tied up with straps, bungee cords, and duct tape, handcuffed, legs shackled, tasered or otherwise restrained, immobilized, or placed in solitary confinement in order to bring them under control. Roughly 1,500 kids are tied up or locked down every day by school officials in the United States. At least 500 students are locked up in some form of solitary confinement every day, whether it be a padded room, a closet, or a duffel bag. In many cases, parents are rarely notified when such methods are used. In almost every case, these undeniably harsh methods are used to punish kids for simply failing to follow directions or throwing tantrums. Very rarely do the kids pose any credible danger to themselves or others. For example, a 4-year-old Virginia preschooler was handcuffed, legs shackled, and transported to the sheriff's office after reportedly throwing blocks and climbing on top of the furniture. School officials claim the restraints were necessary to protect the adults from injury. A 6-year-old kindergarten student in a Georgia public school was handcuffed, transported to the police station, and charged with simple battery of a schoolteacher and criminal damage to property for throwing a temper tantrum at school. Unbelievably, these tactics are all legal, at least when employed by school officials or school resource officers in the nation's public schools. According to a ProPublica investigative report, such harsh punishments are part of a widespread phenomenon plaguing school districts across the country. Indeed, as investigative reporter Heather Vogel points out, this is a local story everywhere. It's happening in my town. It's happening in your town. It's happening in every school district in America. This is the end product of all those so-called school safety policies, which run the gamut from zero-tolerance policies that punish all infractions harshly to surveillance cameras, metal detectors, random searches, drug-sniffing dogs, school-wide lockdowns, active shooter drills and militarized police officers. Mind you, this is all part of the government's plan to harden the schools. What exactly does hardening the schools entail? More strident zero-tolerance policies, greater numbers of school cops, and all the trappings of a prison complex, unsurmountable fences, entrapment areas, no windows or trees, etc. Schools acting like prisons. School officials acting like wardens. Students treated like inmates and punished like hardened criminals. Even in the face of parental outrage, lawsuits, legislative reforms, investigative reports, and endless cases showing that these tactics are not working and should never be used for punishment or discipline, full-grown adults, police officers and teachers alike insist that the reason they continue to handcuff, lock up and restrain little kids is because they fear for their safety and the safety of others. Fear for one's safety has become such a hackneyed and threadbare excuse for behavior that is inexcusable. Dig a little deeper and you'll find that explanation covers a multitude of sins, whether it's poorly trained police officers who shoot first and ask questions later, or school officials who are ill-equipped to deal with children who act like children, meaning they don't always listen, they sometimes throw tantrums, and they have a hard time sitting still. Unfortunately, advocates for such harsh police tactics and weaponry like to trot out the line that school safety should be our first priority lest we find ourselves with another Sandy Hook. What they will not tell you is that such shootings are rare. As one congressional report found, the schools are, generally speaking, safe places for children. In their zeal to crack down on guns and lock down the schools, these cheerleaders for police state tactics in the schools might also fail to mention the lucrative, multi-million-dollar deals being cut with military contractors such as Taser International to equip these school cops with tasers, tanks, rifles, and $100,000 shooting detection systems. Indeed, the transformation of hometown police departments into extensions of the military has been mirrored in the public schools, where school police have been gifted with high-powered M16 rifles, MRAP armored vehicles, grenade launchers, and other military gear. One Texas school district even boasts its own 12-member SWAT team. According to one law review article on the school-to-prison pipeline, many school districts have formed their own police departments, some so large they rival the forces of major United States cities in size. For example, the safety division in New York City's public schools is so large that if it were a local police department, it would be the fifth largest police force in the country. The ramifications are far-reaching. The term school-to-prison pipeline refers to a phenomenon in which children who are suspended or expelled from school have a greater likelihood of ending up in jail. As if it weren't bad enough that the nation's schools have come to resemble prisons, the government is also contracting with private prisons to lock up our young people for behavior that once would have merited a stern lecture. Nearly 40% of those young people who are arrested will serve time in a private prison, where the emphasis is on making profits for large megacorporations above all else. This profit-driven system of incarceration has also given rise to a growth in juvenile prisons and financial incentives for jailing young people. Indeed, young people have become easy targets for the private prison industry, which profits from criminalizing childish behavior and jailing young people. For instance, 2 Pennsylvania judges made headlines when it was revealed that they had been conspiring with 2 businessmen in a $2.6 million kids for cash scandal that resulted in more than 2,500 children being found guilty and jailed in for-profit private prisons. So what's the answer, not only for the here and now the children growing up in these quasi-prisons but for the future of this country? Peter Gray, a professor of psychology at Boston College, believes that school is a prison that is damaging our kids, and it's hard to disagree, especially with the numbers of police officers being assigned to schools on the rise. Clearly, the pathology that characterizes the American police state has passed down to the schools. Now, in addition to the government and its agents viewing the citizenry as suspects to be probed, poked, pinched, tasered, searched, seized, stripped, and generally manhandled, all with the general blessing of the court, our children in the public schools are also fair game. Instead of raising up a generation of freedom fighters, however, we seem to be busy churning out newly minted citizens of the American police state who are being taught the hard way what it means to comply, fear and march in lockstep with the government's dictates. After all, how do you convince a child who has been routinely handcuffed, shackled, tied down, locked up, and immobilized by government officials all before he reaches the age of adulthood that he has any rights at all, let alone the right to challenge wrongdoing, resist oppression, and defend himself against injustice? Most of all, how do you persuade a fellow American that the government works for him when for most of his young life, he has been incarcerated in an institution that teaches young people to be obedient and compliant citizens who don't talk back, don't question and don't challenge authority? What can be done? Without a doubt, change is needed, but that will mean taking on the teachers' unions, the school unions, the educators' associations, and the police unions, not to mention the politicians dependent on their votes and all of the corporations that profit mightily from an industrial school complex. As we've seen with other issues, any significant reforms will have to start locally and trickle upwards. As I point out in my book Battlefield America, The War on the American People, with every school police raid and overzealous punishment that is carried out in the name of school safety, the lesson being imparted is that Americans, especially young people, have no rights at all against the state or the police. If we do not rein in the police state's influence in the schools, the future to which we are sending our children will be characterized by a brutal, totalitarian regime. About John W. Whitehead. Constitutional attorney and author John W. Whitehead is founder and president of the Rutherford Institute. His new book Battlefield America, The War on the American People, Select Books, 2015, is available online at www.amazon.com. Whitehead can be contacted at johnw@rutherford.org. Police use who may want to retaliate against him physically.
Hey Charlotte County, this is Charlotte County Cop Watch, and I just wanted you to know that I am using this stuff under fair use, and also remember to like and subscribe this channel. Also too, keep in mind I do not make any money on YouTube. This is 5 hours work a day, fighting for freedom. And you can donate with PayPal and Patreon. I just want you to think about this. If everybody gives to PayPal and Patreon, Patreon is every month. Actually, PayPal you can do every month. I have 12,000 subscribers. If everybody gives, I can quit my regular job and go full-time investigations on Charlotte County and possibly even more and beyond. So just keep that in mind. If everybody helps out, I can go full-time doing this. Thanks.